Gaul is a whole divided into three parts, of which one is inhabited by the Belgae, another by the Aquitani, and a third by a people in their own tongue called Celtae, in our language, Galli. All these are different from one another in language, institutions, and laws. That is the pretty famous beginning of one of the most influential books in history, written by one of the most influential men ever. It's Julius Caesar's De Bello Gallico, on the Gallic Wars. They're famous first lines, among other reasons, because, funny enough, it's the first real Latin that generations of European schoolboys would encounter in their studies. But this is no schoolboy's book. Like countless other great commanders, Napoleon kept a copy of this book with him when he went on his campaigns, and he wrote a whole commentary on it when he was at the end of his life in exile on St. Helena. In On the Gallic Wars, De Bello Gallico, Caesar catalogues the 9-year campaign he fought to conquer all of what is now modern France, modern Belgium, some of Switzerland, and a little more too. He spent 9 years away from Rome, in his prime, politically speaking, and he never entered the city of Rome or Italy proper for that entire time, which is pretty incredible. But this was the campaign that made his career and forged the foundation of modern France, and you could even argue the whole of modern Europe. It was not inevitable that the Romans should rule these lands by any stretch. But it's useful to consider for a moment, why did Caesar write this text, this 8-book masterwork that we're going to do book 1 of in this episode? Well, there are many reasons, and we'll discuss them along the way, but I think the number one reason that scholars surprisingly don't talk about a whole lot is this. Caesar wrote De Bello Gallico to educate his future talent pool. He believed immensely in the power of having talented people around you, and he wanted to show the Romans of ambition and talent what kind of man he was and the sort of men that he attracted to himself, the sort of commanders and engineers and other leaders that he wanted, what skills and expertise and character he expected of them, and also the kind of qualities that the regular soldiers were expected to have if they wanted to fight under Caesar. And I think it's interesting, he does point out many mistakes that he and his officers and his soldiers make. He's genuinely trying to teach you. And I think that this number one reason that here you have one of history's greatest leaders and strategists opening up his playbook to share with you his secrets, that explains to you both why this text was so popular and influential for so many great conquerors and leaders and artists, and it also explains what you can get out of it. But Caesar also wrote this book because he had a political career to build in Rome. These are his war reports that he would send back to the Senate and the people of Rome to entertain, to instruct, to dazzle, and, yes, of course, to present his actions in a certain way to voters and power brokers and critics. And we'll talk about the political dynamics as we go along. But this brings us to another reason why you should pay attention to this text, because it is also a masterclass in storytelling from one of Rome's best ever, when he's at his finest and had everything on the line. The venture capitalist, Don Valentine, used to say that the skill of storytelling is of incalculable value. I paraphrase here, because basically capital follows storytelling. And Caesar was very good at raising capital from men like Crassus. See the episodes that we did on him, episodes 72 through 74. And I think you can start to see why in reading this book. Now, the first thing that strikes you about this book when you crack it open is how vast and complicated the territory Caesar is looking at is. Here's how it begins, and I'm reading from the public domain Loeb translation by Edwards, by the way, which I occasionally modify for clarity. I also really like, if you want to buy a physical book, the Landmark edition. It's got many notes and maps and explanatory essays. It's great. I'll be referring to it often for this series, alongside the Napoleon commentary as well. Okay, here we go. The vast, complicated territory of Gaul. And I'll pause for comments here and there as I read various passages. All right, quote, Gaul as a whole is divided into 3 parts. One of them is inhabited by the Belgae. These people live in what's Belgium today. It's named after them. Another part is inhabited by the Aquitani. This is Aquitaine, which is in southwest France. And a third, here we go, by a people called in their own tongue Celtae, in our own Latin language, Galli. All these are different from one another in language, institution, and laws. The Galli, and I'll call them Gauls from here on out, are separated from the Aquitani by the river Garonne, from the Belgae by the Marne and the Seine. Of all these people, the Belgae are the most courageous, because they are furthest removed from the culture and civilization of the Roman province, and least often visited by merchants introducing the commodities that make for effeminacy. Isn't he right on that point? And also because they are nearest to the Germans dwelling beyond the Rhine, with whom they are continually at war. And we'll meet these Belgae in Book 2. But here he's going to turn to the tribe in question in this book. For this same cause, the Helvetii also excel the rest of the Gauls in valor, because they are struggling in almost daily fights with the Germans, either endeavoring to keep them out of Gallic territory or waging an aggressive warfare into German territory. End quote. So Caesar is standing, let's imagine, in the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul. He'll generally call it just Provincia, the province in these texts. The Romans already directly rule a pretty decent-sized chunk of what's now France. Let's say, a tenth of France, in the southeast corner of that territory, the part closest to Italy. It's basically a strip along the coastline that goes all the way to Spain, but also toward the east it juts upward north along the Rhone Valley, all the way to Vienne, about 200 miles inland. And this region, more or less, is now called Provence, from that original name, Provincia. So the Romans control that. That's Transalpine Gaul. And Caesar is right now, the year is 58 BC, he's the governor of Transalpine Gaul. He's also the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, which is what the Romans called northern Italy, north of the Po River, which is more or less the part of modern Italy that does not physically stick out into the Mediterranean. And there are a lot of tamer Gallic peoples in Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul. And Caesar has an extraordinary 5-year command of these two provinces and also Illyricum, which is more or less Slovenia and Croatia. You can listen to the lives of Pompey and Crassus that we did already for some of the backstory of how he got that command. Now, you might know the story of how Caesar, once when he was around 33, on a tour of duty in Spain, the story goes, he saw a statue of Alexander the Great, and he burst into tears. And his friends asked him, "Caesar, what's the matter?" And he responded, "Do you not think it is a matter for sorrow that while Alexander at my age was already king of so many peoples, I have as yet achieved no brilliant success?" So Caesar, from early on in his career, he knew the historical figure he was trying to emulate or even outdo. By this point, I suggest you might want to figure that out for yourself too, if you haven't yet. And there's another story kind of to this point. When he was crossing the Alps around this time that he saw the statue of Alexander, sort of around that age, he was in some podunk town in the Alps, probably a Gallic town, and one of his buddies says to him, Caesar, I bet these silly little natives have their own struggles for supremacy within their own towns. Like we Romans strive for the highest office of consulship in our city. Oh, how pathetic, and he laughs. And Caesar looks at him dead serious, and he says, I would rather be the first man in this town than the second man in Rome. So those are the stakes for Caesar, really, of this campaign. He's now 42, and he's looking at this vast territory. And he's been consul already in the previous year in 59. He's a great politician, yes, but he's thinking he's got 5 years to prove himself a great commander, worthy of the company of Alexander the Great. And 5 years is pretty short as a span of time to take over all of France, you might say, especially considering the Romans have a really checkered military record with the Gauls. It was the Gauls who torched the city of Rome. Back in 390 BC, they torched Rome itself. They captured it. And it was Gauls who, after many other signal victories against the Romans, quite recently also annihilated a gigantic Roman army at Arausio in 105 BC, and they invaded Italy itself. This is all very much in living memory for a lot of the older Romans at this time. You'll recall some of this story if you've listened to the life of Marius and Sertorius. Bottom line here is that these people are tough, and the Romans know it. They're tall and scary, but also wild and crafty, extremely warlike. Even the softer of them are very scary. But let's go on. Okay, so now he's introduced some of the main tribal constituencies that he's going to deal with throughout the book. But last of all, in that paragraph we just read, he mentioned the Helvetii, who are a very warlike tribe of Gauls. They live in the western part of modern Switzerland. Helvetia is what the Romans called that area, and that does indeed border on the Rhine, so it's close to the Germans. And these guys, the Helvetii, or the Helvetians, are the focus of the first half of Book 1. And Caesar goes on to tell us about the Helvetians a little more. In particular, this one noble Helvetian. And this is a little bit of backstory he's giving us here. Quote, "Among the Helvetians, the noblest man by far and the most wealthy was Orgetorix. In the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, that's 61 BC, so 3 years earlier, the Romans named the years after the consuls who serve in them. So in 61, Orgetorix's desire for the kingship led him to form a conspiracy of the nobility, and he persuaded the community to march out of their territory in full force, urging that as they excelled all in valor, it was easy enough to secure the sovereignty of all Gaul. In this he persuaded them the more easily because the Helvetii are closely confined by the nature of their territory." End quote. And Caesar goes on and he explains very carefully here in the text. The Helvetians live in this plain on the north side of Lac Léman, and their territory is bounded by the Jura Mountains to the north and to the west, and then the lake, Lac Léman, and the Rhone River to the south, and then by the Rhine and the Germans to the east. And according to Caesar, they're hankering for what you might call Lebensraum, more room to live. I know that's a German word, not a Gallic word, but it kind of gives you the idea. So Orgetorix, this noble, this rich noble of the Helvetii, he wants to use this plan of expansionism to elevate himself to a position of king. The Gauls at this point are all ruled by aristocratic councils, so they're oligarchies. But they have this not too distant memory of relatively recently when they were ruled by kings. And guys like Orgetorix in this story, they're always scheming to restore the kingship and put themselves on the throne. So Orgetorix, on the side here, as he's proposing this expansionism to his fellow Helvetii, he launches this secret conspiracy. And so he approaches a couple of other nobles from other tribes. And one in particular is a man named Dumnorix. And he's a guy to keep your eye on for later in the story. That Rix suffix, by the way, Orgetorix, Dumnorix, it's the Celtic equivalent of the Latin rex, king. So many of these Gallic nobles even have king built into their names. So, this is all pretty understandable that they'd want these sort of things. Okay, well, here's Caesar on Orgetorix. Orgetorix, quote, likewise persuaded Dumnorix of the Aedui. The Aedui is another key tribe. Dumnorix, the brother of Diviciacus, who at that time held the chieftaincy of the state of the Aedui and was a great favorite with the common people. He's talking about Dumnorix there. Orgetorix persuaded Dumnorix to a like endeavor and to give him his own daughter in marriage. He convinced Dumnorix and the other nobles in on the conspiracy that it was easy enough to accomplish such endeavors because he himself, Orgetorix, so he said, was about to secure the sovereignty of his own state. End quote. So these Aedui are actually important Roman allies. And these guys live on the other side of the Rhone in central France. More on them later. But so, unfortunately for Orgetorix, his plot to make himself king is discovered, and the rival nobles put him on trial in chains, basically for treason. And if he's guilty, the punishment for aiming at the kingship is to be burned alive. But Orgetorix, on the day of the trial, he manages to bring a lot of his thugs into the court, and he stages an escape, but then afterwards he apparently commits suicide. But anyway, so that's the backstory. But Orgetorix kind of started this fire in the bellies of the Helvetians, and they are convinced now that they need that Lebensraum, and they're up for an adventure. And here's where Caesar gets excited, because the Romans don't believe in unprovoked, aggressive wars of conquest, in theory at least. There has to be some plausible danger a governor is addressing in order for him to engage in a military campaign in his province. So here's what the Helvetii do. They're fired by this vision of expansionism. Here's what they do, according to Caesar. Quote, "When at length they deemed that they were prepared for that purpose, they set fire to all their strongholds, in number about 12, their villages in number about 400, and the rest of their private buildings." So they're burning their entire state. It's amazing. And what's more, they burnt up all their grains, save that which they were to carry with them, to the intent that by removing all hope of returning homeward, they might prove the readier to undergo any perils. And they commanded every man to take for himself from home a 3 months' provision of victuals. They persuaded their neighbors, the Rauraki, the Tulingi, and the Latobrigi, other Gallic tribes, to adopt the same plan, burn up their strongholds and villages, and march out with them. End quote. So they're going to march out. Where are they planning to go exactly? Well, Caesar later suggests it's mainly just a nice plot of land near the Atlantic coast. But yet here, he frames this expedition as the Helvetians scheming to take over all of Gaul. Since they believe themselves to be the most warlike of all, and it's rightfully theirs, well, of course, that second explanation would clearly be a plausible threat to Roman interests. But, he may be exaggerating here. They may just want to move their territory to near the Atlantic. But either way, he's actually got a pretty strong case that this is a problem that he needs to deal with as governor, because, he explains, the route that they wanted to take was south, through the Roman province, going around the southern foot of the Jura Mountains. And this is also the territory of the Allobroges, who are Gauls, but they are Roman allies, and they're living in the Roman province. The principal city of the Allobroges is Genava, which is modern Geneva. So, Caesar finds all this out through his informers, and he decides, hey, these Helvetians are going to rob and plunder as they make their way through the province, so they've got to be stopped. So he gets ready. The Helvetians conveniently set out in March of 58, which is just when Caesar is beginning his term as governor of Transalpine Gaul. And so here's what he does as they start marching out. And note here, I'm going to read this passage, that Caesar usually speaks about himself in this text in the third person. This gives him a kind of air of objectivity. All right, here's Caesar. Quote, "When Caesar was informed that they were endeavoring to march through the Roman province, he made speed to leave Rome, and hastening to Transalpine Gaul by as rapid stages as possible, he arrived near Geneva. From the whole province he requisitioned the largest possible number of troops, though there was in Transalpine Gaul no more than a single legion, and he ordered the bridge at Geneva to be broken down." So he breaks down this bridge over the Rhone River at Geneva to keep the Helvetians from crossing. And note here, he's only got one legion, which is a little less than 5,000 men. And military history fans should take note that this is the famous 10th Legion, which became one of his most trusted elite forces. They fought bravely at the Battle of Pharsalus. Okay, going on. Quote, "Now when the Helvetii learned of his coming, they sent as deputies to him the noblest men of the state, with instructions to say that their purpose was to march through the province without any mischief, because they had no other route, and they asked that they might be given leave to do so by Caesar's goodwill. Caesar, however, remembering that the consul Lucius Cassius had been slain, and his army routed and forced to walk under the yoke by the Helvetii, by these very same Helvetii. That major Roman upset was in 107 BC, a while back, but this is a great opportunity for Caesar to remind his Roman readers that these people are dangerous. So continuing on here, Caesar considered that no concession should be made, for these reasons he just stated, nor did he believe that men of unfriendly disposition, if granted an opportunity of marching through the province, would refrain from outrage and mischief. That's really key here. He's underlining the reasonable threat. However, here's what he does. To gain an interval for the assembly of the troops he had levied, that is, beyond the single 10th legion that he's got, he replied to the deputies of the Helvetii that he would take a space of time for consideration. If they wished for anything, they were to return on the 13th of April. End quote. So he's buying some time here, by saying, let me think about it. But really what he's going to do is prepare for war. And the Helvetii, he notes later on, they're moving their entire nation, and this amounts to considerably more than 300,000 people, including at least 90,000 fighting men, and he's only got 5,000 or so. Now check this out. This is pretty amazing what he does next. Again, note Caesar's talking in the third person here. In the meanwhile, he used the legion which he had with him and the troops which had concentrated from the province to construct a continuous wall 16 feet high and a trench from the Lake of Geneva, that's Loch Lomond, which flows into the River Rhone, to the Jura Range, a distance of 19 miles. And if you look at the map, this basically cuts the Helvetians off and makes it so that their only choice is to march through the Jura Mountains, which they really don't want to do. And many scholars here doubt that Caesar could have pulled off this incredible fortification work so quickly. But for the doubters, I think it's worth going behind the scenes for just a sec here with Napoleon himself to get into the mind of a great general. And this is a quote from Napoleon's commentary on Caesar's Gallic Wars. Quote, "The ordinary field fortifications of the Romans consisted of a V-shaped ditch 12 feet wide by 9 feet deep. With the spoil, that is the dirt that they dug out, they erected a bank 4 feet high and 12 feet wide, on which they raised a parapet 4 feet high, made of stakes driven 2 feet into the ground, which meant that the crest of the parapet was 17 feet higher than the bottom of the ditch. A 2-yard running section of this fortification, requiring 324 cubic feet of excavation, 12 cubic yards, could be completed by 1 man in 32 hours or 3 days of work, or by 12 men in 2 or 3 hours. The legion which did the work could have completed its 14 miles of defenses, 19 Roman miles is about 14 modern miles by his calculations, involving 168,000 cubic yards of excavation in 120 hours or 10 to 15 days' work." End quote. I think there's a lesson there. If you're wondering if you can do something hard, sit down and do the math. I think Caesar did, and I think he built the thing. And here's what it allowed him to do. And we're going back to Caesar's words now. Quote, "This work completed, Caesar posted separate garrisons in entrenched forts in order that he might more easily be able to stop any attempt of the enemy to cross against his wish. When the day which he had appointed with the deputies arrived and the deputies returned to him, he said that following the custom and precedent of the Roman people," note how he frames it there, the Roman people, "he could not grant anyone a passage through the province, and he made it plain that he would stop any attempt to force the passage. Disappointed of this hope, the Helvetii attempted, sometimes by day, more often by night, to break through, either by joining boats together and making a number of rafts, or by fording the Rhone where the depth of the stream was shallowest. But they were checked by the line of entrenchment. And remember, this wall is running right along the river for the most part. And as the troops concentrated rapidly, they were repelled also by missiles, and so abandoned the attempt." End quote. So now the Helvetians give up, and they say, well, we've got to cross the Jura Mountains. And the Jura are high and forbidding, but they're not Alps high, All the peaks are below tree line. They're basically big hills. However, the Jura, and especially the plains on the other side of the Jura to the north, are the territory of another great Gallic confederacy called the Sequani. And so the Helvetians reach out to their friend Dumnorix of the Aedui, remember him from earlier, who they know also has great influence among the Sequani, and they ask him to intercede on their behalf and Dumnorix works out a deal, and the Sequani say, okay, you can pass, and they exchange hostages. And so the Helvetii get moving their nation slowly through the Jura Mountains. At this point, Caesar has a problem. The Helvetii are now safely going from outside the Roman province through a route even further outside the Roman province, the territory of the Sequani, to a destination outside the Roman province, the territory of the Santones near the Atlantic. But Caesar, here in the text, he makes the case that, well, the Helvetii, if they get to the territory of the Santones, they're going to end up in a spot close enough to Roman interests in the province that they were a reasonable threat. And so he's got to stop these Helvetians stirring up trouble in the neighborhood. And if you look at the map, it's a bit of a stretch, to be honest. But this decision, he makes it anyway, it leads Caesar to make a fateful move. And, he's going to engage them on their route. And he kind of tosses it in here very nonchalantly. But, I think it's also notable that he doesn't hide this fact. He says, Caesar led his army into the territory of the Allobroges, and from there into the territory of the Segusiavi. This is him talking here, this is the nearest people outside the province and across the Rhone, end quote. So he's just taken a step that will come back, you might say, to haunt him. And he'll take this step many times, actually. He's crossed with an army outside of the boundary of his own allotted province. You're supposed to get authorization from the Senate to do something like that. So this is technically illegal. And we'll get to the ramifications of that, which are big, later. And you already have a concept of this if you've listened to the life of Pompey. I mean, you got to imagine Caesar's enemy, Cato the Younger, for one thing, is paying very close attention to these rules and Caesar breaking them. But I think it's a lesson, if you're going to break the rules, it's often good to tell people about it and not hide the fact for them to find out about it later. The Senate is going to read this report here, remember, so Caesar's admitting it. But what you want to do is what Caesar does here, which is sandwich that fact in between some very good reasons for your doing so, for breaking the rules. And I mentioned the first reason, this generic threat to Roman interest from having a warlike tribe settle near-ish to the province. But lucky for Caesar, the Helvetians give him, and of course the Roman people, as he says, great reason to be alarmed. You see, they get through the land of the Sequani, and they get into the territory of the Aedui, and the Aedui are further west from the Sequani. And once they get there, the Helvetii start ravaging farms and plundering property. Now, the Aedui, remember, are Roman allies, even though they're not in the Roman province. And, oh, by the way, as he notes, the Allobroges, who are also Roman allies, have some villages in this area, and these guys are getting plundered too. And so all these Gauls, Caesar says, they come and they complain to Caesar. And this was really a key mistake by the Helvetians. And, you could say, hey, they had no choice. They're running out of food. But this is why, as they say, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Because since the Helvetii failed to bring enough supplies, or they failed to arrange to get them peacefully when they ran out, well, they had to take what they could get wherever they could get it. But this act of ravaging Roman allies, this is really going to come back and bite the Helvetians hard, because now Caesar has casus belli. So, just to summarize here, Caesar blitzes back into northern Italy, and he brings back with him, at last, 5 whole new legions, so some 25,000 men that he's raised. He's got a real army now. Some of them are new recruits, some of them are semi-veterans. But thanks to his incredible, famous speed, he speeds up through the Rhone Valley and he catches the Helvetian folk by surprise right as they are making their way across another river, the Saône. And just as they've brought 3/4 of their forces across, which took the Helvetii a whopping 20 days. It's such a huge and chaotic mass of people and wagons and women and children. Well, Caesar strikes them as they're crossing in the night. And in the chaos, the Romans slaughter a huge number of these Gauls. It's devastating. And Caesar makes a very interesting comment here. He says, quote, "These people," the ones that they killed, "were from the tribe that is called Tigurini, for the whole Helvetian nation is divided into 4 cantons. In the recollection of the last generation, it was this tribe, this canton, that had marched out alone from its homeland and had slain the consul Lucius Cassius, who we mentioned earlier, and sent his army under the yoke." That was this disaster from 107 BC going on. "And so," Caesar says, "whether by accident or by the purpose of the immortal gods, the section of the Helvetian state which had brought so signal a calamity upon the Roman people was the first to pay the penalty in full." End quote. And, Caesar doesn't usually go in for this kind of thing, this divine retribution stuff, but since he's got the opportunity, he takes it. And he knows this kind of will of the gods stuff is going to play very well among the Roman plebs, divine vengeance for their crimes. Whenever the messengers get to Rome and they relay this stuff in the forum, it's very good propaganda. Now, here, you might be tempted to feel sorry for these poor Helvetians, especially the Tigurini, minding their own business, trying to have a good Volkerwanderung, as it were. And here the mean Romans come along and they slay them. And I get that perspective, yes. However, Caesar explains what happens next. And this next part is some really good storytelling. All right, so he builds a bridge across the Saône and he crosses his army over in a single day, which wows the natives with Roman technological mastery. And so they send him a delegation. And who would they choose but a man named Divico, who, so it happened, was the very general who had led the army that had destroyed the consul Lucius Cassius nearly 50 years earlier. He must have been a really old man, but he still got some fire. Here's Caesar describing the encounter. "Divico treated with Caesar as follows," I'm reading here, "if the Roman people would make peace with the Helvetii, they would go whither and abide where Caesar should determine and desire. If, on the other hand, he should continue to visit them with war, he was advised to remember the earlier disaster of the Roman people and the ancient valor of the Helvetii. Caesar had attacked one single tribe unawares, when those who had crossed the river could not bear assistance to their fellows. But that event must not induce him to rate his own valor highly or to despise them. The Helvetii had learned from their parents and ancestors to fight their battles with courage, not with cunning or reliance upon stratagem. Caesar should therefore take care lest the place of their conference derive renown or perpetuate remembrance by a disaster to the Roman people and to the destruction of an army." End quote. Well, those sound like fighting words. To these remarks, Caesar replied as follows. As he remembered well the events to which the Helvetian deputies referred, he had therefore the less reason to hesitate, and his indignation was the more vehement in proportion as the Roman people had not deserved that earlier misfortune. And even if he were willing to forget an old affront, could he banish the memory of recent outrages, their attempts to march by force against his will through the province, their ill treatment of the Aedui, the Ambari, the Allobroges? So he's pointed that earlier assault on his fortifications back at the Rhine, like, hey, they started it, you could argue. Their insolent boast of their own victory, their surprise that their outrages had gone on so long with impunity, pointed to the same conclusion. For, listen to this, it was the custom of the immortal gods to grant a temporary prosperity and a longer impunity to make men whom they purposed to punish for their crime smart all the more severely from a later change of fortune. Yet for all this, Caesar would make peace with the Helvetii if they would offer him hostages to show him that they would perform their promises, and if they would give satisfaction to the Aedui in respect of the outrages inflicted on them and their allies, and likewise to the Allobroges. End quote. So Caesar is more or less demanding that they surrender and submit. But listen to how the old man comes back. Divico replied, says Caesar, it was the ancestral practice and the regular custom of the Helvetii to receive, not to offer, hostages. The Roman people was witness thereof. With this reply, he departed. End quote. It is not looking good for the Helvetians. But in all fairness, they do massively outnumber the Romans. So, long story short here, Caesar starts pursuing the Helvetians as they march further from the river. There are some skirmishes. In one of the skirmishes, the Romans' cavalry loses in a little engagement, and the Helvetians get really confident. And it's important to note, throughout this campaign, the Roman cavalry is almost entirely composed of foreign auxiliaries, namely local Gallic allies who have sent contingents of knights along with their horses. So that happened. But as Caesar's going on, harassing the Helvetians, he runs into another problem. He's asked the Aedui, Roman allies, remember, to support the war effort by providing food supplies. And the Romans are getting very low on food, and the Aedui keep coming up with excuses. So Caesar smells something fishy going on here, and he eventually pulls some of the Aedui chief leaders into a council, including the Virgobret of the Aedui, which is their chief annually elected magistrate. And this is an office that is controlled by the famous priestly class of the Gauls, the Druids. More on these interesting people later. Well, so this Virgobret of the Aedui, this magistrate, his name is Liscus this year, and after some cross-examination by Caesar, Liscus breaks down and he admits there are powerful people among the Aedui sowing dissension and making it their goal to prevent the Romans from ever getting any supplies. The Virgobret does not name any names here, but Caesar has his suspicions. So he dismisses everybody but Liscus, the Virgobret, and he basically says, it's Dumnorix, isn't it? And Liscus confesses, yes, it's Dumnorix, which is that crafty Aeduan noble who was scheming with Orgetorix way back, with the Helvetii, with the Sequani. And in fact, Caesar finds out Dumnorix was the man responsible for this recent minor defeat of Caesar's Gallic auxiliary cavalry. That turns out was on purpose. They threw the fight, amazingly. But this presents him with another problem. He's found the guy, but, here's what's going on in Caesar's mind. And here's what he's going to do about it. Some more great storytelling here. Quote, Caesar deemed all this to be cause enough for him either to punish Dumnorix himself or to command the state of the Aedui to do so. To all such procedure, however, there was one objection. The knowledge that Diviciacus, the brother of Dumnorix, showed the utmost zeal for the Roman people, the utmost goodwill towards Caesar himself, in loyalty, in justice, in prudence, alike remarkable. For Caesar apprehended that the punishment of Dumnorix might offend the feelings of Diviciacus. So Diviciacus, Dumnorix's brother, he's one of the other Aeduan nobles, and Caesar actually keeps a number of these guys in his camp as, let's call them advisors, and not hostages. But so Diviciacus is actually in his camp, and Diviciacus happens to be a druid. More on the druids in later episodes. So going on here, he summons Diviciacus alone, and he presents the facts before him. And Caesar's like, well, what should I do? Quote, with many tears, Diviciacus embraced Caesar and began to beseech him not to pass too severe a judgment upon his brother. I know, said he, that the reports are true, and no one is more pained thereat than I. For at a time when I had very great influence in my own state and in the rest of Gaul, and he very little by reason of his youth, he owed his rise to me, and now he is using his resources and his strength not only to the diminution of my influence, but almost to my destruction. For all that, I feel the force of brotherly love and public opinion. That is to say, if too severe a fate befalls him at your hands, talking to Caesar, no one, seeing that I hold this place in your friendship, will believe that it has been done without my consent. And this will turn against me the feelings of all Gaul. While he was making this petition at greater length and with tears, Caesar took him by the hand and consoled him, bidding him to end his entreaty and showing that his influence with Caesar was so great that Caesar excused the injury to Rome and the vexation felt by himself in consideration for the goodwill and the entreaties of Diviciacus. Then he summoned Dumnorix to his quarters, and in the presence of his brother he pointed out what he had to blame in him. He set forth what he himself perceived, and the complaints of the state. He warned him to avoid all occasions of suspicion for the future, and said that he excused the past in consideration for his brother Diviciacus. He posted sentinels over Dumnorix, so as to know what he did and with whom he spoke." End quote. There's a great lesson, I think, for someone in power. Sometimes they say what seems like malice is really incompetence, but then very often what seems like incompetence is actually malice of one form or another, and you got to do some sleuthing sometimes to figure out which it is. Well, pretty soon the war all comes to a head near this hill fort that the Romans decide to camp nearby, a place called Bibracte. It's in the territory of the Aedui. It's near modern-day Autun. And basically what happens is Caesar is starting to build a camp on this favorable site on a hill, and the Helvetians see he's, preoccupied. They launch a sudden mass attack. Caesar quickly sets up his lines halfway up the hill. He's got his army 3 lines deep with the new recruits in the back. You want to ease them into this whole war thing, of course. And the Helvetians are therefore at a disadvantage because, they're downhill. It's a lot harder to charge uphill than downhill. They've also got this little stream at their back, which hampers their retreat. But they go ahead and they give it all they've got. For, as Napoleon observes, they were a dauntless people. They also, again, greatly outnumber the Romans. And I'll just read you a snapshot of the battle that Caesar gives us. And just note here how Caesar is going to make use of all the advantages he can. He always does this. Terrain being one of the chief ones. We've already mentioned the dynamics there. He's got the high ground. Also, Roman engineering and technology is another aspect. In this instance, they have these spears called the pilum, and you'll see what they do in the battle. But then, of course, his personal presence is really huge here. And here's a passage from his description of the battle's beginning. This is the so-called Battle of Bibracte. Quote, "Caesar first had his own horse, and then those of all the others, sent out of sight, thus to equalize the danger of all, and to take away hope of flight. Then after a speech to encourage his troops, he joined battle. The legionaries from the upper ground easily broke the mass formation of the enemy by a volley of javelins, and when it was scattered, they drew their swords and charged. The Gauls were greatly encumbered for the fight because several of their shields would be pierced and fastened together by a single javelin cast." This javelin here is the Roman pilum. "And as the iron from the Roman pilum became bent, they could not pluck it out of their shields, nor fight handily with the left arm encumbered. Therefore many of them preferred, after continued shaking of the arm, to cast off the shield and so to fight bare-bodied. At length, worn out by wounds, they began to retreat, retiring toward a height about a mile away." So here they retreat across the stream that was behind them to a hill on the other side. "The Gauls gained the height, and as the Romans followed up, the Boii and the Tulingi," these are other Helvetian tribes, "who with some 15,000 men brought up the rear and formed the rear guard, turned from their march to attack the Romans on the exposed flank and overlapped them." So they're attacking the Romans from behind now. "Noticing this, the Helvetii, who had retired to the height, began to press again and to renew the fight." So they turn around and go downhill. "The Romans turned their standards and fought the battle in 2 directions. The first and second line to oppose the part of the enemy which had been defeated and driven off, and now turned back on them. The third to check the fresh assault." End quote. Yeah, so those new recruits at the back, they get a chance to show their stuff on the field. And in the end, after a very hard fight, the Romans finally drive the Helvetians back to their circled wagon camp. And this fight lasts from noon until deep in the night. But eventually the Romans capture the Helvetian camp and drive the enemy in flight. Then all the way up until that final fight at the Helvetian baggage camp, Caesar says that nobody saw a single enemy turn his back. And Plutarch actually covers this battle in his Life of Caesar, and he adds that in the night battle at the wagons, quote, not only did the men themselves make a stand and fight, but also their wives and children defended themselves to the death and were cut to pieces with the men. A dauntless people. And so the Romans chased the Helvetians to a spot 4 days' march away, and they forced them to surrender. And with that, the Helvetian War was over. In the wagon camp, Caesar finds tablets in the Gallic language using Greek script, which is interesting, and it indicates how many people the Helvetians had left their homeland with on these tablets that he finds. The whole migration, he says, was about 368,000. In addition to that, he counts about 92,000 who were capable of bearing arms. The rest will have been the old, the servants, and of course the women and the children. Of those who returned home, a census was taken in accordance with Caesar's command, so this is sometime later, and the number was found to be 110,000. Wow. Only a third or so of the people made it back home, because after the battle, he compels them to resettle in their own territory, those that have not been taken as slaves or killed. And probably many of those 250,000 odd people who were lost, many of them might have ended up fleeing and taking residence in nearby Gallic towns, maybe returning home much later. But of course, tens of thousands died, and as we said, many were surely taken by the soldiers as slaves and either kept or sold off in the slave markets. Truly an epic disaster for the nation of the Helvetians. Well, you might have thought Caesar accomplished all you could hope to in a single campaign season, and I think your average Roman commander would have agreed. Time to build some forts, sharpen some swords, but Caesar has a very refined sense for opportunities, and he only has 5 years, right? So no time to waste. Well, the very next thing that happens, as he recounts, is emissaries come to him from the leaders of tribes all over Gaul, praising him and thanking him, of course, for taking care of the disruptive Helvetians, and they bring another matter to his attention. It's interesting here, by the way. They actually ask his permission to go hold their own private tribal conclave without him present. And so, by asking him permission, they're implicitly acknowledging his authority here. And he, of course, says, yes, that's fine, go ahead. And so these Gaulish nobles come back, they return after their little private council, and they've agreed to present another very concerning matter to the general of the Romans. And it's his loyal friend Diviciacus, the Druid, who gets picked to deliver the news. Some Germans have crossed the Rhine in recent years, about 15,000 of them. Diviciacus explains that it was actually the Sequani that called the Germans in as basically mercenaries because they were warring with his own tribe, the Aedui. But now the Sequani have found, to their dismay, that these originally hired henchmen, the Germans, have quickly become their masters. And the king of these German allies, who has turned into their overlord, is a man named Ariovistus. Ariovistus and his Germans defeated the Aedui in a big battle, and in the process they killed many of the flower of the Aeduan nobles, and then he forced the Aedui, Roman allies remember, to submit hostages to him and to the Sequani as guarantees of their good behavior. But then Ariovistus managed to extort the Sequani into giving some of their own nobles and their own, in particular, children of those nobles as hostages as well. And now Ariovistus is planning to bring over even more Germans and gradually force the Sequani, and who knows, any and all other nearby Gallic nations out of their homes and replace them with Germans, according to Caesar, according to Diviciacus. And here Caesar reports the speech that Diviciacus makes, and, he characterizes this haughty German king, Ariovistus. I'm going to skip it here because we're actually going to hear from Ariovistus himself shortly. That's a good characterization. And so they're in this council in front of all these Gallic nobles from various tribes. Caesar's hearing them out. And Diviciacus ends his speech about the terrors of Ariovistus by bursting into tears and begging for Caesar's help and intervention. And here's how Caesar responds. Quote, Caesar noticed, however, that of the company, the Sequani alone did not act like the rest, but with head downcast, stared sullenly upon the ground. So the Sequani nobles are there too. Caesar asked the Sequani why they were acting thus. The Sequani made no reply, but continued in the same sullen silence. When repeated questioning could not extract a word from them, Diviciacus the Aeduan made further reply. The lot of the Sequani, he said, is more pitiable, more grievous than that of the rest, inasmuch as they alone dare not even in secret to make a complaint or entreat assistance, dreading the cruelty of Ariovistus, as much in his absence as if he were present before them. The rest, for all their suffering, still have a chance of escape, but the Sequani, who have admitted Ariovistus within their own borders, and whose towns are all in his power, must needs endure any and every torture. End quote. So these Sequani nobles are worried, if Ariovistus hears about them complaining, that their sons are going to suffer for it. So it's important to point out here the way that Caesar is presenting this. He's not just picking sides in an internal battle between the Gauls, right? He's got an opportunity here to be the champion of all the Gauls against these even more barbarian Germans. And maybe he can pick up another ally for the Roman people in the process, befriend these Sequani. That's at least the way he portrays this. And he explains to his readers, letting the Roman ally Aedui get pushed around, get their nobles terrorized, hostages held under dire threat. Well, this did not comport with the dignity of the Roman people, did it? And furthermore, he says, quote, Caesar could see that the Germans were becoming gradually accustomed to cross over the Rhine, and that the arrival of a great host of them in Gaul was dangerous for the Roman people. Nor did he suppose that barbarians so fierce would stop short after seizing the whole of Gaul, but rather, like the Cimbri and the Teutones before them, and here, of course, he's harking back to the great Cimbrian Wars under Gaius Marius that we've already mentioned, not so long ago, they would break forth into the province, these Germans, and pushed on thence into Italy, especially as there was but the Rhone to separate the Sequani from the Roman province. All this, he felt, must be faced without a moment's delay. Indeed. As for Ariovistus himself, he had assumed such airs, such arrogance, that he seemed insufferable. End quote. So you can see where this is going. But Caesar makes a lot of effort to start by taking a more conciliatory course. And here's what he does. Quote, Caesar resolved, therefore, to send deputies to Ariovistus to request that they choose some halfway station between them for a parley, as it was his desire to discuss with him matters of state and of the highest importance to each of them. To the deputation, Ariovistus made the reply that if he had had need of any kind from Caesar, he would have come to him, and if Caesar desired anything of him, he ought to come to Ariovistus. And he found himself wondering what business either Caesar or the Roman people might have in that Gaul which Ariovistus had made his own by conquest and war. End quote. Well, this is getting very interesting indeed. So Caesar shoots back and he keeps playing the role of, no, I'm just trying to be reasonable here. I think we should give him some credit that this tack was taken in earnest. But of course, he knew the kind of man he was dealing with, and he introduces an interesting fact into the mix. So listen to this. Quote, when this reply had been brought back to Caesar, he sent deputies again to Ariovistus with the following message. Forasmuch as, after the great kindnesses of treatment from Caesar himself and from the Roman people, for it was in Caesar's year of consulship that Ariovistus had been saluted as king and friend by the Senate, Ariovistus expressed his thanks to Caesar and the Roman people by reluctance to accept the invitation to come to a parley and by thinking it needless to say or learn anything as touching their mutual concerns. Caesar's demand of him was... ... and we'll get to that in a second. So apparently, we don't know much about this besides what Caesar says here, but apparently Ariovistus for some reason had actually approached the Senate the year before In 59, that's when Caesar was consul, and Caesar arranged for Ariovistus to be saluted as a king, recognized as a regional player in Gaul, as king, which is vague, but it's not nothing. And this is the attitude that Ariovistus now takes with the Romans. So here's what Caesar demands. Caesar demanded, quote, first, that Ariovistus should not bring any further host of men across the Rhine into Gaul. So don't bring any more Germans across. Second, that he should restore the hostages he held from the Aedui and grant the Sequani, the poor Sequani, the full freedom to restore to the Aedui, with Ariovistus' full consent, the hostages that they held. So the Sequani are holding these hostages of the Aedui, he implies, on Ariovistus' behalf, or at his orders. Further, that he should not annoy the Aedui by outrage, nor make war upon them or their allies. So Caesar's taking pains to stress here for his Roman readers that he's working on behalf of the Aedui, the Roman allies. If Ariovistus did as requested, Caesar and the Roman people would maintain a lasting kindness and friendship towards him. If Caesar's request were not granted, then Caesar would not disregard the outrages suffered by the Aedui. End quote. Now listen to this. To this, Ariovistus replied as follows. It was the right of war that conquerors dictated as they pleased to the conquered, and the Roman people also were accustomed to dictate to those whom they conquered, not according to the order of a third party, but according to their own choice. If he, for his part, did not ordain how the Roman people should exercise their own right, he ought not to be hindered by the Roman people in the enjoyment of his own right. He's like, hey, I thought you guys were conquerors too. This is how we conquerors do things, isn't it? The Aedui, having risked the fortune of war and having been overcome in a conflict of arms, had been made tributary to himself. Caesar was doing him, Ariovistus that is, a serious injury, for Caesar's advance was damaging his revenues. Ariovistus would not restore their hostages to the Aedui, nor, however, would he make war on them nor on their allies without cause if they stood to their agreement and paid tribute yearly. If not, they would find it of no assistance whatever to be called brethren of the Roman people. As for Caesar's declaration that he would not disregard outrages suffered by the Aedui, no one had fought with Ariovistus save to his own destruction. Caesar might try the issue by force whenever he pleased. He would learn what invincible Germans, highly trained in arms, who in a period of 14 years had never been beneath a roof, could accomplish by their valor. End quote. And I love that last jab. We Germans sleep under the stars, unlike you pampered townsfolk. Unlike these pampered Gauls, even. Well, Caesar decides it's time to snap into action. And he hears Ariovistus is on his way to try to occupy a town called Vesontio, modern Besançon, which is in the territory of the Sequani. And as he remarks, it's an amazingly good place to put a city. He says, the Doubs River practically surrounds the whole town in a circle such that it looks as if it had been drafted by a compass. And the remainder of the circumference, a length of only about 1,600 feet, that the river does not cover, is occupied by a towering hill, shaped so that the lower slopes on either side touch the river. End quote. And if you look at Besançon on a map, you'll see what he's talking about. So, he wants to get there before Ariovistus can, and he blitzes to Vesontio, modern Besançon, and he occupies it before, indeed, Ariovistus can get there. But when he gets there, his officer corps start fraternizing with the locals. Quote, the local Gauls and traders affirmed to these men that the Germans were men of mighty frame and an incredible valor and skill at arms. For they themselves, so they said, the locals, said at meetings with the Germans, they had often been unable even to endure their look and the keenness of their eyes. And so great was the panic among Caesar's officers, and so suddenly did it seize upon all the army, that they were terrified nearly out of their senses. It began first with the tribunes, the prefects, and others who had followed Caesar from Rome to court his friendship without any great experience in warfare." End quote. And, a lot of these young guys are senators' sons. They're here to shine up their CVs, sleep in a tent, rough it a little with some Gallic bushmeats maybe, make some money off the plunder. They think there's an understanding here. Caesar knows their dads. He's not going to turn them into cannon fodder. Well, these guys start coming to Caesar after hearing about the Germans. And, they've got various stories about how, bad timing, Caesar. I need to deal with some business back at the family farm. There's an inheritance matter I need to sort out. Got to get back to Rome, Caesar. You understand these things. Caesar sees right through this. And other guys, by the way, start saying, well, it's the soldiers are really concerned, sir. And it's not that they're afraid of Ariovistus and the Germans, but, there's some concern about the supply lines getting cut off. And, they're even talking about a mutiny, blah, blah, blah. Caesar is very annoyed, and he calls a war council of his officers, and he delivers a long speech to all these guys. And he even brings in the lower-ranking centurions so they can know what he thinks about all this talk. And he's giving you a lesson here, I think, in how a leader should encourage people who are really doubting the enterprise that they're embarked on. And a first lesson here is learn to recognize fear when you see it, because probably nobody will openly say, "Hey, I'm afraid." So he begins by reprimanding them. First and foremost, because they thought it was their business to ask or consider in which direction or with what purpose they were being led. So first, you might have to shock them out of their fear by shaming them. You got to replace that one negative emotion with another, more productive one. And then he goes on to explain, and I paraphrase here, Ariovistus sought the friendship of the Roman people in the past. I'm sure he'll come around to see reason any moment now. But even if he doesn't, and we have to fight this out, do you doubt the strength of Roman arms? And he reminds them of Gaius Marius's smashing victories over the Cimbri and the Teutones 40 years earlier. So, he first brings in precedents for why they shouldn't be afraid of, yes, this thing that they are actually afraid of, but not admitting. And Gaius Marius here is a very loaded example. Marius was a populist from the previous generation, and Caesar's kind of built a career on taking on the mantle of Marius, this populist mantle, and importantly, he's taking on the constituency of Marius. So furthermore, Caesar says, interestingly, and this is news to the readers, that in fact, Ariovistus defeated the Aedui not by force and courage, but by subterfuge, lying in wait in the swamps until the Aedui had their guard down. And they're not going to fool the Romans. And the Helvetii also have beaten the Germans in the past. And you see, we just spanked the Helvetii, so it holds to reason, and so on. Anyway then, so after he's addressed their real fear, then, kind of as an afterthought, he addresses these silly pretenses about concern about the supply lines. He says basically, come on, you're talking to Caesar here. Logistics is my business. And here's why we have nothing to worry about. The Sequani and the other tribes are bringing us grain, etc., etc. So, he does address those, concerns that they voiced. And I think that's important because this allows the captains to save a little face. But so once he's done with his speech, they're all won over, according to his account. They're enthusiastic to start this war, and they say, yes, of course, we were never in the slightest bit afraid. We certainly never meant to question your authority, sir. And that's how he settled that matter. Well then, now that the two armies are closer to each other, Ariovistus finally sends some emissaries to say, okay, we can have a parley now. Now that you've come to me like I stipulated. And so Caesar agrees. Long story short, they meet each other with a small mounted detachment each, and the two leaders talk on horseback with each other. But it seems Ariovistus was either trying to buy time with a distraction or even that he was maybe hoping to physically capture Caesar with his guard down, as we'll see in a second. But before that, Ariovistus, in their parley, he dares to say the following in their meeting. Quote, This is Ariovistus talking. Unless Caesar departed and withdrew his army from this locality, Ariovistus would regard him not as a friend, but as an enemy. And if he put Caesar to death, he would gratify many nobles and leaders of the Roman people. This he knew for certain from themselves, by the messengers sent on behalf of all whose favor and friendship he could purchase by Caesar's death. If, however, Caesar departed and resigned to Ariovistus the uninterrupted occupation of Gaul, Ariovistus would recompense him with a great reward and would, without any exertion or risk on Caesar's part, execute any campaigns he might wish to see carried out. End quote. So, I like how Caesar suggests that his political enemies at home, who object to his war, are corrupt and in the pocket of the enemies of Rome. That's a very deft move rhetorically. So, after Ariovistus kind of threatens to kill Caesar, well, Caesar gets busy politely explaining to Ariovistus, sorry, this is just not how the Roman people do business. This is not how they treat their allies, backing down on commitments to defend them. And the Romans insisted that the Gauls should be free, etc., etc. And he's going on, but unfortunately, the meeting is actually broken up prematurely when Ariovistus's knights start hurling stones at Caesar's knights, their horsemen. So, like a scuffle is about to break out, and they break up the meeting. Both men ride away. Nothing is resolved. The next day, Ariovistus says, he sends a messenger, basically, hey, yesterday was all a big misunderstanding. Let's talk again. But Caesar really doesn't trust him now. And he sends a couple of Gallic nobles in his place to go try to parley with Ariovistus. And what do you know? Ariovistus seizes them and puts them in chains. And with that, it looks like it's go time. So negotiations have broken down. They're at war. Ariovistus moves up his camp to 2 miles away from Caesar's position at Vesantio. He's cutting off supplies to the city, and Caesar marches out. He offers an infantry battle, but Ariovistus declines. Strange. Ariovistus does do some skirmishing with his cavalry, though. He doesn't commit his infantry. And listen to Caesar's description of how the Germans do cavalry stuff. Quote, the kind of fighting in which the Germans had trained themselves was as follows. There were 6,000 horsemen and as many footmen, as swift as they were brave, who had been chosen out of the whole force, one by each horseman for his personal protection. They worked with the horsemen in encounters. On them the horsemen would retire, and they would concentrate speedily if any serious difficulty arose. They would form around any trooper who fell from his horse, these, footmen, if he was severely wounded. And if it was necessary to advance farther in some direction or to retire more rapidly, their training made them so speedy that they could support themselves by the manes of the horses and keep up their pace. End quote. Amazing. And we're going to see the British do something similar a few episodes from now. And also the Thebans did that at the Battle of Mantinea, as we recounted in the life of Agesilaus, king of Sparta. Well, anyway, so it's all inconclusive for a few days, these skirmishes going back and forth. And Caesar decides, finally, to try to provoke Ariovistus a little bit more. And he moves up and he starts building a camp just 600 paces from Ariovistus's fort. Now Ariovistus responds by sending out all his cavalry and 16,000 light-armed skirmishers to try to harass the Romans. Caesar's got 6 legions, I think, so 30,000 men. So the Romans are digging earthworks and throwing up ramparts. I mean, they're literally building a fort right there, 2,000 feet away. They're cutting down trees, and the Germans are throwing spears at them, trying to intimidate them. And here's one of my favorite lines in the book. Quote, Caesar did exactly as he planned. So he splits up the army, some to build the fort, others to defend the guys building the fort, and he gets it done right there in front of Ariovistus' camp. But then, very interestingly, big talking Ariovistus still keeps his main forces in his fort, in his camp. What's going on? Caesar explains. by questioning many captives. Caesar found out the reason why Ariovistus did not fight a decisive action. And I'm going to quote Plutarch here, who gives a somewhat more colorful description than Caesar does at this point. Plutarch says, quote, "The spirit of the Germans was blunted by the prophecies of their holy women, who used to foretell the future by observing the eddies in the rivers and by finding signs in the whirlings and splashings of the waters, and now forbade joining battle before a new moon gave its light." End quote. So, he's caught them at a moment where the omens are bad. Now, if you've come across some intelligence that your enemy or your competitor is holding off from the competition for some, you might say, external reason, well, that's a pretty good time to force them to engage you right when they're most uncomfortable. And that's exactly what Caesar does. He draws up all of his forces right before the gates of the enemy camp. And you just know all of the German generals and lieutenants and the rank and file men are just maddened at the fact that they're looking like cowards refusing to fight. And this provocation works. Sure enough, Ariovistus finally breaks down and he ignores the old ladies and he leads all his men out and lines them up for battle. And here's what happens next. Quote, "The Germans fenced in their whole battle line with their chariots and wagons, arranged behind them in a semicircle. Upon these they set their women, who with tears and outstretched hands entreated the men as they marched out to fight, not to deliver them into Roman slavery." And this, I suppose, they figured would be motivating, both physically cutting off their escape to the rear with those wagons and reminding them of the stakes very clearly with the women sitting upon them. So going on here, "Caesar put all of his legates and his questor, each in command of a legion, that every man might have them as witness to his valor. He himself took station on the right wing, having noticed that the corresponding division of the enemy was the least steady, and he joined battle. Our troops attacked the enemy so fiercely when the signal was given, and the enemy dashed forward so suddenly and swiftly, that there was no time to discharge javelins upon them. So javelins were thrown aside, and it was a sword fight at close quarters. But the Germans, according to their custom, speedily formed a phalanx, a shield wall, and received the sword attack. A number of our soldiers were found brave enough to leap onto the phalanx of the enemy, tear their shields from their hands, and deal a wound from above." These are the kind of guys that Caesar wants in his army, right? Going on, "The left wing of the enemy's line was beaten and put to flight, but their right wing, by sheer weight of numbers, was pressing our line hard. Young Publius Crassus, commanding our cavalry, noticed this, and as he could move more freely than the officers who were occupied in and about the line of battle, he sent the third line in support of our struggling troops. This restored the battle, and all the enemy turned and ran, and they did not cease in their flight until they reached the Rhine River." End quote. And the Rhine is some 40 or 50 miles away. Caesar says 5 miles, but that seems to be wrong. That's probably due to some medieval copying error. So you notice there, at the end, young Publius Crassus is the man Caesar gives credit for turning the tide in a key moment of the battle. Publius Crassus, the son of Marcus Crassus, Rome's great financier, the triumvir, Caesar's backer. Caesar, of course, knows that Publius's father will be reading these reports. Well, with that, Caesar chases the Germans all the way back across the Rhine, that he's not able to kill or capture before they get there. And he makes it sound like most of them actually were killed or captured. But Ariovistus himself manages to get across in a boat and escape to safety, never to terrorize the Gauls again. Caesar also soon gets reports that other tribes of the Germans, like the Suebi, who had crossed the Rhine further downstream, that they wisely decided to go back home to Germany once they heard the news. And with that, Caesar declares it a job well done, and he sends his troops into winter quarters. Mission accomplished. The Aedui are freed from their oppressors, and the Sequani are liberated. But just One point of curiosity here. Caesar mentions kind of offhand in his narrative that Ariovistus has quite a few Gauls fighting under him, as well as Germans. And there is a lost epic poem on this campaign that we know about that was written by a guy named Varro of Atax. And this is not the more famous Varro, Pompey's friend. It's a different Varro. Well, this Varro of Atax wrote a poem that he was an eyewitness to on the Ariovistus War, but he didn't call it the war with the Germans or the war with Ariovistus. He called his poem Bellum Sequanicum, the war with the Sequani. Wait, I thought the Sequani were the ones who were pleading for Caesar's help against Ariovistus, their oppressor. Kinda makes you wonder. Maybe there was more to the story, somehow, than what we got. But, hey, aren't all stories that way? Stay tuned for next time when we'll go further north and meet the Bell guy. If you enjoyed this, if you love ancient heroes, tell a friend, leave a comment, leave us a good review. It really helps other people find this stuff. And we're on a mission here, after all. Thanks for listening. Stay strong. Stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.